The wind cut like a blade through the alley. Liam Cole's boot crunched on ice, but it was Ranger's low growl that stopped him dead. The German Shepherd was frozen, staring into the shadows where a small, hunched figure was digging through the trash. The faint, sour smell of unwashed clothes and frozen garbage hit him as he stepped closer. For former Sergeant Liam Cole, this was another night of walking. He avoided the silence of his empty house, the walks his only solace. His neighbors knew him as quiet but dependable. He did his odd jobs with precision, but he rarely stayed to talk or laugh. Liam was 38, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose heavy winter coat fit snugly over a frame hardened not only by military training, but by years of carrying unseen burdens. His hair was dark brown, cropped close with hints of silver at his temples. A trim beard shadowed his square jaw. His eyes, stormy blue, seemed always halfway between vigilance and sorrow. 3 winters earlier, Liam had lost his wife, Sarah, to an illness that had turned his world upside down in a series of hushed hospital room goodbyes. Sarah had been the light in his life. Her absence left behind a cavern that routine alone could not fill. The one companion who had remained constant was Ranger, his dog and loyal shadow. Ranger was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, not trained for any official duty, but possessing a fierce intelligence and a deep, instinctual loyalty. Standing tall and powerful, his coat gleamed a rich blend of black and tan. His amber eyes carried a striking mix of alertness and warmth, and his every step seemed in rhythm with Liam's. To outsiders, Ranger was an imposing figure. But to Liam, Ranger was family. The wind cut hard through the streets, sharp as a blade. Liam adjusted his thick jacket, his boots crunching on the icy sidewalk. The world was still. He thought, not for the first time, how Christmas had become just another date on the calendar, stripped of warmth. He had grown used to that emptiness, or so he told himself. Ranger's sudden tension snapped him out of his thoughts. The German Shepherd froze, ears pricking forward, muscles coiling tight beneath his coat. A low rumble left his chest, not aggressive, but alert. His leash pulled taut as he turned sharply toward the alley behind the local supermarket. His nose lifted to catch a scent carried on the bitter air. Liam stopped mid-step, his instincts kicking in. He had learned to trust Ranger without question. Whatever the dog sensed was never trivial. "What is it, boy?" Liam murmured, though his voice was carried away by the wind. Ranger tugged forward, determined, his paws digging into the snow as if he could no longer wait. Liam followed, boots crunching more loudly now as they left the cleared path of the sidewalk and descended into the shadowy alley. The flicker of an overhead security light cast long, wavering shapes against the brick walls. Dumpsters lined the back, their lids crusted with frost, and the ground was scattered with torn cardboard and frozen bags of refuse. At first glance, the alley was empty, but then Liam noticed movement. Something shifted near one of the dumpsters, slow and deliberate. His hand instinctively hovered near the heavy flashlight he carried, but Ranger's focused stillness told him it wasn't an animal, not a raccoon or stray cat. The outline was too human, too fragile. Liam's breath hitched. His military-honed instincts short-circuited at the sight of the child's trembling, reddened hands. There, crouched low beside the trash, was a child. She was small, no older than 6 or 7. Her thin frame swallowed by a jacket that hung loose and ragged, its purple fabric dulled and torn. Dark hair, knotted and unkempt, fell across a face that looked too pale under the jaundiced glow of the light. Her small hands, bare and reddened by the cold, sifted through discarded containers and scraps with the practiced precision of someone who had done this before. Every motion was careful, methodical, as if she feared wasting effort. Liam froze. He had seen hardship during his deployments, poverty, neglect, but never like this. Never a child so small, alone, and desperate enough to dig through trash for survival on a night meant for family. The girl's shoulders hunched against the cold, her breath puffing out in small clouds as she leaned over a half-crumpled bag. She lifted what looked like the remains of a sandwich, holding it close as if it were a prize. Her fingers trembled from the freezing air, yet she clutched the food tightly, as though letting go might mean it disappeared. Ranger let out a soft whine, his amber eyes locked on her. He sat down obediently, tail swishing lightly against the snow, as if even he sensed the fragility of the moment. Liam's chest tightened. For the first time in years, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crack. The pain of losing Sarah had taught him to stay guarded, to shut out the world. But this sight, it cut deeper than his grief. A child should never be here, scavenging through garbage on Christmas Eve. For a long moment, Liam stood rooted to the spot, unable to speak, unable to move. All the cold of the winter night seemed to seep into him, mingling with the chill of realization. The silence of the town pressed in, broken only by the soft sound of the girls' searching hands. And in that frozen alley, under the flickering light, a weary veteran, his loyal dog, and a fragile child's silhouette collided in a way that would alter the course of their lives forever. Liam's heart, hardened by loss, now throbbed with something long buried, the instinct to protect. The air in the alley seemed to grow heavier the moment Liam realized what he was seeing. The girl's fragile frame crouched against the dumpster, her hair falling into her face as she clutched the crust of bread she had scavenged. For an instant, he felt rooted in place. A cold knot, tighter than any he'd felt in combat, twisted in his gut. Then, slowly, carefully, he began to move. "Hey." His voice was low, steady, the same tone he used with Ranger when the dog grew restless. The girl jerked her head up, and the terror in her wide brown eyes struck him harder than any enemy fire ever could. She was no older than 7, but her gaze carried the weight of someone who had already been cornered too many times. She pulled the stale sandwich tighter against her chest, her thin arms trembling. In that moment, she looked like a bird, wings clipped, pressed against the bars of a cage no one else could see. Liam froze mid-step, raising one hand gently, palm outward. He knew the look in her eyes. Fear that wasn't just fear of the night or the cold. It was fear of people, fear taught by experience.
At Bonds Unspoken, we believe every story between a human and their animal companion deserves to be heard. If you agree, please share and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you can join us every time another bond speaks louder than words.
Beside him, Ranger shifted. The German Shepherd, 5 years old and in his prime, had the kind of presence that commanded attention. Yet instead of barking, instead of leaning forward in a protective stance, Ranger did something else entirely. He eased down onto his haunches, then lowered himself fully to the ground, his belly pressing into the snow. He let out a soft, pleading whine deep in his chest. His tail brushed lightly over the snow. His ears flicked forward, his amber eyes softening with a slow, almost human patience. Ranger wagged his tail once, twice. The girl's gaze flicked to the dog. For a heartbeat, the rigid line of her shoulders loosened. Liam seized the moment. He crouched too, lowering himself until he was eye level with her. The snow bit into his knee, but he ignored it. He wanted her to see him not as a looming figure, but as a man grounded, unthreatening. "My name's Liam," he said quietly, his breath curling in the frigid air. "And this here is Ranger. He's a good boy. He won't hurt you." The girl said nothing, her lips pressed together, her knuckles whitening around the sandwich, but her eyes, still trembling, shifted again toward Ranger. The dog tilted his head, ears twitching, and gave another small thump of his tail against the snow. Finally, a whisper so faint Liam almost missed it. "Emily." Her whisper was so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind, leaving only the ghost of a name hanging between them. He repeated it carefully, letting the syllables rest in the air between them. "Emily." She nodded once, just barely, as if to confirm she hadn't made a mistake by trusting him with it. Liam leaned his forearms on his knees, keeping his posture relaxed. Now that he was closer, the details carved themselves into his mind. Emily's cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked from the cold. The purple jacket she wore was tattered at the cuffs, far too big for her frame, as though it had been handed down or salvaged. Her leggings were thin, the fabric stretched and pilled, and her small sneakers were soaked through from the snow. "How long have you been out here, Emily?" he asked softly. Her eyes darted down away from his, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then haltingly she said, A few days. Her voice was raspy, barely louder than the wind. Liam swallowed hard. A child alone, in December cold for days. He glanced at Ranger, who had inched closer, moving with deliberate calm until his large body sat only a few feet away from her. Emily didn't flinch this time when his thick fur brushed against her sleeve. She startled slightly, but didn't pull back. Instead, she let him stay there, his steady warmth seeping into her shivering frame. Liam noticed the way her small hand, though still gripping the sandwich, shifted closer to Ranger, as if unconsciously seeking comfort. The sight pressed hard against something in his chest that had long been dormant. "You must be freezing," Liam said. His voice cracked slightly despite his effort to keep it level. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Emily's throat worked as she tried to answer. She glanced at the half-eaten bread in her hand, then shook her head. "I don't remember." Her honesty cut deeper than any admission. It wasn't dramatized, wasn't meant for pity. It was the plain truth of survival. Liam exhaled slowly, his breath fogging. He wanted to reach out, to lift her away from this place, but he knew too sudden a gesture might drive her off. He had seen it before in war-torn villages, children who carried their mistrust like armor. To push too hard was to lose them. Instead, he let Ranger lead. The shepherd shifted again, lying fully on his side now, a gesture of complete trust. His tail swished softly, and then he lifted his head and nudged Emily's knee with his nose. Emily blinked down at him. A tiny, uncertain smile flickered at the corner of her lips, the first hint of softness on her face. She raised her hand slowly, hesitating as though expecting to be bitten, then brushed her fingers against his fur. The contact seemed to steady her breathing, her small shoulders easing just slightly. Liam watched the exchange, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and something more complicated, something he hadn't felt since before Sarah's death. Hope. He drew a breath, his voice gentler than he remembered it could be. "Emily, you don't have to keep doing this. You're not alone right now." Her gaze lifted to his, and for the first time he saw not just fear, but exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft hum of the wind through the alley and Ranger's steady breathing. Emily finally whispered, "I was just so hungry." The words were broken, but they carried the weight of days spent scavenging, of nights curled up against walls that offered no warmth. Liam felt the urge to gather her up immediately, to take her out of this alley and into somewhere safe. But he held himself still. Trust was delicate, and right now it was Ranger's steady presence that tethered her to this moment. So he stayed crouched, watching as Emily leaned a little more into the shepherd's fur, her face pressed close to the warmth she had been denied for too long. The walk back to Liam's pickup truck was slow, each step a delicate negotiation of trust. Emily kept close to Ranger, her small hand now resting tentatively on the shepherd's back, as if he were a furry, living railing. The wind had picked up, slicing through the alley with renewed vigor, and Liam instinctively moved to shield Emily from its worst bite, his large frame blocking the gusts as they made their way to the quiet street. His old dark blue truck was parked a block away, its windshield already dusted with a fresh layer of snow. As they approached, Emily hung back, her eyes wide as she looked from the vehicle to Liam and back again. "It's okay," Liam said, his voice low and calm. "It's just my truck. It's warm inside." He opened the passenger door, the interior light casting a soft, welcoming glow. Emily stared at the cab, then at Ranger. The shepherd, understanding his role, placed his front paws on the running board and then hoisted himself smoothly onto the worn bench seat. He turned and looked back at Emily, his tail giving a soft, encouraging thump against the upholstery. That was all the persuasion she needed. She climbed in after him, her movements small and careful, and immediately curled into the space between Ranger and the door. Liam gently closed the door, the sound a solid, final thud that separated them from the freezing night. The engine turned over with a reliable rumble, and Liam cranked the heat. The ride through the sleeping town was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the whisper of the tires on packed snow. Liam glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds. Emily sat with her knees drawn to her chest, the half-eaten sandwich still clutched in her hand. She wasn't eating it. She was just holding it, a talisman from her old life. Ranger lay beside her, his head in her lap, his warm, heavy presence a silent promise of safety. She had one hand buried deep in the fur of his neck, her fingers slowly unclenching. Liam's small, two-story house sat on the edge of Pine Creek, a modest structure painted a faded gray with a porch that wrapped around the front. It had been too quiet for too long. He pulled into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching a new rhythm into the night. "Here we are," he said, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt profound. He came around and opened her door. Emily hesitated, looking from the dark house back to Ranger. The shepherd nudged her gently, then jumped down, landing silently in the snow. He stood by Liam's side, waiting for her. Taking a shaky breath, Emily slid out, her thin sneakers sinking into the fresh powder. Liam led the way to the front door, his keys jangling in the stillness. The lock turned with a heavy click, and he pushed the door open into a dark hallway. He reached inside, flicking a switch. A warm, yellow light from a lamp in the living room spilled out, illuminating a worn but clean rug and the simple furniture beyond. "Welcome home," he said, the words feeling strange and significant on his tongue. Emily stepped across the threshold as if entering a sacred space, her eyes darting everywhere, taking in the wooden floors, the brick fireplace, the staircase leading up. The air inside smelled of old wood, coffee, and a faint hint of pine from a basket of cones near the hearth. It was a world away from the stale, frozen stench of the alley. Ranger trotted in ahead of them, his nails clicking on the floor, and headed straight for a woven dog bed in the corner of the living room. He circled once and lay down, but his alert eyes remained on Emily. "You must be frozen straight through," Liam said, breaking the silence. "How about a hot shower? I can find you some clean clothes that'll fit better." Emily looked down at her ragged purple jacket and wet sneakers, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He showed her to the small downstairs bathroom, the one Sarah had always kept stocked with fluffy towels. "There are clean towels right here," he said, pointing. "I'll be right outside the door." While the water ran, steam soon fogging the mirror, Liam went upstairs to his bedroom. He rummaged through a chest of drawers, past his own clothes, until he found what he was looking for: an old, soft gray sweatshirt from his college days, and a pair of sweatpants he could tie tightly at her waist. They would be comically large on her, but they were clean, dry, and warm. He placed the stack of clothes outside the bathroom door. "Clothes are right here, Emily," he said through the door. "Take your time." He retreated to the kitchen, giving her space. He clenched the countertop until his knuckles turned white, then forced himself to relax before she returned. He busied his hands, warming a can of chicken noodle soup on the stove and making a grilled cheese sandwich, the simple, comforting foods his own mother had made for him when he was sick. The familiar sizzle of butter and the savory smell of soup filled the small kitchen, layering over the old scents of the house, making it feel, for the first time in years, lived in. When Emily emerged, the transformation was startling. The grime was gone, revealing pale, delicate skin flushed pink from the hot water. His old sweatshirt engulfed her, the sleeves hanging down past her fingertips, the hem brushing her knees. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, yet more like the child she was meant to be. But her eyes, those wide brown eyes, still held a deep, unsettling wariness. Liam gestured to the small table in the kitchen. "I made you some food." She climbed onto the chair, her legs dangling. She looked at the bowl of soup and the golden brown sandwich as if they were artifacts from a dream. Her first sip was tentative, a mere touching of a spoon to her lips. Then another. And then, as if a dam had broken, she ate with a desperate, focused hunger, the spoon clinking rapidly against the bowl. Then the tears came. They weren't loud sobs, but a silent, relentless stream down her cheeks, dripping into her soup. She cried as she ate, as if the warmth and the food had unlocked a sorrow too vast to contain. Liam sat quietly across from her, his own throat tight. He didn't speak, just let her cry and eat, each tear a testament to the relief and the memory of pain. Between ragged breaths, her voice, small and broken, finally broke the silence. My aunt, she had a belt. It hung on the wall. The words hung in the warm, steamy air of the kitchen. Liam stayed perfectly still, listening. My mama, she died when I was little. The words hung in the warm, steamy air of the kitchen. Liam stayed perfectly still, listening. My daddy, he left. Don't even know him. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the enormous sweatshirt sleeve. I lived with Aunt Maggie after that. She made me do all the work, Emily continued, her voice gaining a fragile, shaky momentum. Dishes, floors, laundry. If I didn't do it right, she hit me. As she moved to wipe her tears again, the sleeve of the sweatshirt slid back, revealing a faint, yellowing bruise circling her thin forearm. The sight of it, a stark contrast against the clean gray fabric, sent a cold jolt of anger through Liam's core. He clenched his jaw, forcing his breathing to stay even for her sake. Emily sniffled, looking down at her now empty bowl. I ran away. I just wanted food, just a place to sleep. Her words trailed off, collapsing into quiet, exhausted sobs. Ranger, who had been watching from his bed, rose and padded over. He didn't whine or bark. He simply rested his massive head gently on her lap, his amber eyes looking up at her with unwavering devotion. Emily dropped her spoon, and both of her small hands buried themselves in the thick warmth of his fur. She leaned over, pressing her face into the back of his neck, her crying softening into hiccuping breaths. The dog's steady presence seemed to absorb her trembling. As Liam watched the child lean into his dog, as he saw the first anchor she'd had in who knew how long, he felt a shift within himself. This wasn't just a sad story anymore. This was a life, broken and left in the cold. And as he sat there in his quiet kitchen, he knew, with a certainty that was as deep as his old grief, that he would not, let her disappear back into the darkness. But as he watched her sleep, one question burned in his mind. Who had done this to her? And where were they now? The house grew quiet after midnight, leaving only the faint hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of old timber settling against the winter chill. Emily had finally drifted into a deep sleep on the couch, bundled in blankets, her small hand still buried in Ranger's fur as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. Liam sat in the armchair across the room, watching them. At breakfast the next morning, Emily flinched when he reached for the syrup, her small arm jerking back. In that moment, he knew the investigation wasn't over. It had just begun. The memory of the bruises on her arms and the raw tremble in her voice that convinced him. This was more than simple neglect. It was a pattern of poison. Liam Cole was not the type of man to look away once he saw the truth. He had lost too much in his own life to let another soul, especially one so small and broken, fall through the cracks. By the time the first gray light of Christmas morning filtered through the windows, he had made his decision. Giving Emily a warm bed for one night wasn't enough. He would find out who had failed her and why. Later that morning, the snow crunched beneath Liam's boots as he left the house with Ranger at his side. The shepherd, tall and muscular, walked with a renewed purpose, his ears flicking at every sound, his nose already working the cold air. In his hand, Liam held a small, tattered piece of fabric, the purple scarf Emily had been wearing the night before. She had mentioned in a whisper over breakfast that it had once belonged to her mother, then was passed to her Aunt Maggie. It was the only thing she had carried when she ran. He crouched in the driveway, letting Ranger sniff the fabric deeply. The shepherd's chest expanded with a powerful inhale, his amber eyes narrowing with intense concentration. Then, with a short, decisive bark, Ranger pulled forward, his nose dropping to the snow, following a trail only he could read. They left the quiet streets of Pine Creek, winding out toward the older, more neglected outskirts of town where houses stood farther apart, separated by skeletal trees and frozen fields. The snow grew deeper, the silence heavier, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and Ranger's occasional snuffles as he tracked. The shepherd moved with unerring confidence, leading Liam down a narrow, unplowed lane. Eventually Ranger slowed, his ears swiveling. He stopped before a sagging wooden fence, its pickets broken and gray with age. Beyond it sat a weathered, clapboard house, 2 stories, but shrunken with neglect. Its paint was peeled to a dull, blotchy gray, and the roof was patched with strips of tar paper. The yard was a frozen wasteland of broken toys, rusted cans, and other debris half buried in the snow. Liam's jaw clenched. He had seen places like this before, not in war zones, but in the forgotten corners of his own country, places where despair festered and cruelty hid behind thin, drawn curtains. He unlatched the broken gate, the whine of its rusted hinge cutting through the stillness. He approached slowly, Ranger a steady, vigilant presence at his heel. The windows were clouded with grime and frost, the curtains drawn tight. He knocked once, firmly, on the warped front door. The sound echoed hollowly inside. No answer came. The only response was the creak of the wind pushing against a loose shutter. He tried the knob. It was unlocked. The front door groaned inward on darkness, releasing a thick, oppressive smell of stale cigarettes and rotting food. The smell hit him first, a thick, oppressive mixture of stale cigarettes, mildew, and something acrid and unidentifiable that made his stomach turn. The hallway walls were stained, the plaster cracked like a spiderweb. A sagging couch, its fabric torn and springs jutting out, was pushed against the wall of the living room. Beer bottles and half-burned candles cluttered a low table, their wax drippings frozen in time. Ranger's hackles rose slightly, a low rumble forming in his chest, but Liam calmed him with a touch. "Easy, boy." He moved deeper into the house, every detail sharpening his unease. The kitchen sink was overflowing with unwashed dishes, and rotting food sat in bowls dusted with fuzzy green mold. The air was thick, heavy with the ghost of neglect. Then, in a small back room that felt more like a closet, he found what he feared. Against the wall stood a small, bare bed frame with no mattress, just a wooden plank covered by a thin, soiled blanket. Next to it was a cardboard box filled with cleaning rags and an old, worn-out broom. On the wall, hanging from a single nail at the perfect height for intimidation, was a worn leather belt. Liam's stomach churned. He could imagine Emily, small and hungry, forced to scrub these filthy floors while that belt hung above her head like a constant, looming threat. Ranger sniffed around the makeshift bed, his nose low, his tail stiff. He gave a low, guttural growl, then pawed insistently at the cardboard box. Liam crouched, moving the rags aside. Beneath them, he found a small bundle of papers, crumpled and damp around the edges. He carefully pulled them out and flattened them on the floor. They were official forms, foster care agreements, signed by Margaret H. Crawley, Emily's aunt. But alongside the state documents were other, rougher notes, scribbled in a hasty hand and addressed to names Liam didn't recognize. They spoke of extra money and taking in another one soon. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just about one neglected child. Maggie Crawley had been taking children in, collecting state checks, and then discarding them like burdens once they became inconvenient. His eyes narrowed, the storm within him tightening into a cold, hard resolve. In the corner of the room, a small, rickety dresser rattled slightly as Ranger nudged it with his paw. Liam pulled the drawer open. Inside, beneath a pile of worn-out clothes, he found a folder. Its pages were damp, the edges curling, but inside were photocopied birth certificates, social security cards, and photographs of children. Faces he didn't recognize. Young faces that looked lost, forgotten. It was a record, evidence of a cycle. Liam's breath slowed, his pulse steady despite the rage burning beneath the skin. Emily was not an isolated case. She was part of a chain of abuse and exploitation, hidden in plain sight in this freezing, broken-down house. He crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand on the dog's strong shoulders. "Good work, boy," he murmured. Ranger's tail thumped once against the bare floorboards, though his amber eyes remained sharp, fixed on the hallway as if standing guard. The silence of the house pressed in again, heavy with the ghosts of children who had passed through its doors. Liam rose, clutching the folder of evidence. His mind was already piecing the puzzle together. Maggie Crawley hadn't just failed Emily. She had profited from her, from many. As he stepped back into the freezing daylight, Ranger at his side, Liam felt the weight of the folder in his hand. He clutched the folder of evidence. He could walk away, protect the piece he'd found. Or he could dive back into the darkness and burn this whole operation to the ground. For Emily, the choice was already made. Snow fell thick across Pine Creek, blanketing the streets and silencing even the distant hum of the highway. The storm had settled into the mountain town like a heavy curtain, its flakes sweeping sideways in the wind. Liam pulled his scarf higher around his neck, his breath fogging under the gray afternoon sky. Ranger patrolled at his side, tail low, ears pricked, his amber eyes sharper than the ice clinging to the branches. The folder of evidence felt like a lead weight in Liam's inner jacket pocket. He knew he couldn't handle this alone. This was beyond a veteran finding a stray child. This was a criminal conspiracy. His destination was the Pine Creek Sheriff's Office, a single-story brick building that housed the town's modest law enforcement. He pushed through the door, a bell jingling overhead, and was met with a warm, stale smell of old coffee and photocopier toner. Sheriff Eva Rostova looked up from her desk. A woman in her late 40s with a stern, no-nonsense demeanor and dark hair streaked with a single dramatic shock of silver. She was known for her pragmatism and deep care for the community. Her eyes, the color of weathered slate, narrowed slightly at the sight of Liam's grim expression. "Liam," she said, her voice even. "Heard you took in a stray last night. That's not like you." "It's not a stray, Eva," Liam said, his voice low. He slid the folder across her desk. "It's a little girl, and she's just the beginning." As Sheriff Rostova opened the folder, her expression shifted from curiosity to grim concentration. She sifted through the photocopied birth certificates, the scribbled notes about money, the foster care agreements, all signed by Margaret H. Crawley. The air in the small office grew thick. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Her aunt's house. Out on Old Mill Road. The place is a ruin. There was a belt hanging on the wall, Eva, at child height." Liam's jaw was tight. Ranger found a hidden stash of records. This Maggie woman wasn't just neglecting Emily. She's running a scheme, taking in foster kids for the checks, then discarding them when it's inconvenient. Rostova leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This is serious, Liam. If this is true, it's multi-county, maybe statewide. We have to move carefully. If we spook the main players, they'll scatter. And these kids, they could disappear for good." "That's why I came to you," Liam said. "But we can't wait long. Emily is terrified. She thinks they'll find her." As if on cue, Rostova's radio crackled to life. A deputy's voice, tense and hurried, reported a call about smoke spotted at the old lumber mill on the edge of town. The caller said they saw a vehicle matching the description of Maggie Crawley's truck speeding away from the area. Liam and Rostova exchanged a single, knowing glance. They were burning the evidence. "Let's go," Rostova said, grabbing her jacket and sidearm from a hook. "You and that dog of yours are coming with me. You're material witnesses now. And it seems your dog has a better nose for this than any of my deputies." The ride to the mill was a tense, silent affair, the sheriff's SUV cutting through the deepening snow. Emily was with them, not because anyone wanted her there, but because she had begged Liam through frightened, silent tears, clutching his arm. "Please don't leave me alone. If they find me..." The raw desperation in her whisper had overridden all objections. She now sat bundled in the back seat, a small, anxious shadow, watching the frozen world fly by. The old lumber mill was a skeleton of its former self, a vast complex of rusted metal siding and sagging roofs, its windows long since boarded with rotten planks. As Rostova pulled the SUV to a halt 100 yards away, the faint, acrid smell of smoke reached them, mingling with the clean scent of pine and snow. Ranger was instantly on alert. He stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared at the main warehouse building. A faint orange flicker pulsed against the cracks in the boarded-up windows. "Fire," Rostova stated flatly. "They're cleaning house." They moved in quickly and quietly, their boots sinking into the deep snow. Liam held Ranger's leash tight, the shepherd's muscles coiled like springs. Through a gap in the boards, Liam could see shadowy figures inside, tossing armfuls of paper into a flaming metal drum. He counted 3. The first was a stocky, powerful man in his 40s, with a shaved head and a thick beard peppered with gray. His name, they would later learn, was Calvin Rowe, an enforcer with a record for assault. The second was leaner, taller, with a sharp nose and nervous, darting eyes, Eddie Mullins, a known forger and paper pusher. A woman with short dark hair tucked under a beanie snapped orders, her voice crisp and cold as she tossed a stack of files into the flames. "Burn it faster," Janet Price barked. "If they trace those kids back, we're done." Liam's blood ran cold. He looked at Rostova, who gave a sharp nod. This was it, the point of no return. Liam pushed the heavy, rotting door open with a splintering crash. He didn't have a weapon to raise, but his stance was every bit the soldier, his voice a command that cut through the crackle of a fire. "Sheriff's Department. Hands where I can see them." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Eddie yelped, dropping a stack of files into the flames and bolting for a side exit. Calvin roared, grabbing a length of rusted pipe from the floor and charging. Janet cursed, fumbling for a satchel stuffed with documents. "Ranger, go." Liam commanded, releasing the leash. The shepherd became a blur of focused motion. He launched himself across the frozen concrete, meeting Calvin's charge head-on. The man swung the pipe, but Ranger was faster, ducking under the swing and sinking his teeth into the man's forearm with a powerful, twisting grip. Calvin howled in pain and surprise, the pipe clattering to the ground as he staggered back. Rostova moved toward Janet, who lashed out wildly. The sheriff sidestepped the blow, caught her wrist, and in one fluid motion had her spun around and pressed against the wall, cuffing her hands behind her back. Liam turned, his eyes searching for the fleeing Eddie, just in time to see the man sprinting not for the exit, but straight toward the sheriff's SUV, and the small, terrified face of Emily peering out from the backseat window. Eddie's eyes were wide with a desperate, calculated malice. He saw a shield. "Get back," Liam shouted, his heart lurching into his throat. But Emily, paralyzed by fear, didn't move. Before Liam could take more than a step, Ranger acted. With a savage snarl, the shepherd released Calvin's arm and spun, launching himself across the room in a phenomenal burst of speed. Ranger hit Eddie legs first, the impact a sickening thud of muscle and bone against the frozen concrete. The man went down with a grunt, his breath knocked out, snow and ash exploding around them as they hit the ground. Ranger stood over him, teeth bared inches from his face, a deep, continuous growl vibrating through the air, a living, breathing barrier between the criminal and the child. Emily stumbled back from the car door, her hands flying to her mouth, sobs of terror finally breaking free. In the aftermath, as Rostova secured the suspects and Liam kicked over the barrel to douse the flames with snow, his eyes found Ranger. The shepherd still stood guard over a cowering Eddie, but Liam saw it now, the slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left hind leg, a dark patch of blood matting the fur where Calvin's pipe must have caught him during the scuffle. He knelt beside his dog, resting a hand on the thick, warm fur between his ears. "Easy, boy. You did good." Ranger's breathing was heavy, his sides heaving, but his amber eyes never wavered from his task. He had held the line. He had protected their fragile, newfound family. And in that freezing, smoke-filled warehouse, Liam knew the battle for Emily's future had only just begun. The days after the lumber mill raid passed in a blur of procedural formalities. For Liam, it was a return to a familiar rhythm of reports and timelines, but now viewed from the other side of the desk, as a material witness and a victim's guardian. Calvin Rowe, Eddie Mullins, and Janet Price were held without bail. Their charges now expanded to include conspiracy, fraud, child endangerment, and assault. The charred, but salvageable, records from the fire were being pieced together by state investigators, building a case that reached far beyond the borders of Pine Creek. Maggie Crawley, Emily's aunt, had vanished from her dilapidated house, but a statewide warrant was now active for her arrest. The net was closing, but for Liam, the end of the immediate danger only raised a more profound and personal question, one that echoed in the quiet of his home each night. What would happen to Emily now? The girl remained with him under a temporary emergency protection order. She moved through the rooms of his house like a quiet ghost, always within arm's reach of Ranger, who shadowed her as if sworn to a sacred duty. Sheriff Rostova and a few kindly neighbors had tried to coax smiles from her with hot chocolate and gentle words, but Emily's trust remained reserved for two beings: the veteran who had pulled her from the snow and the German shepherd who had become her steadfast protector. Late one evening, Liam sat at his kitchen table, the surface cluttered with his own neatly written statements. At the top of the pile was a new folder, this one stamped with the official seal of the Colorado Department of Human Services. The manila cover felt heavier than any piece of equipment he'd ever carried in the service. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the weariness from his eyes. His reflection in the dark window stared back, a tired, square-jawed face, streaks of silver visible against his dark, cropped hair. He looked older than 38. Loss had etched deep lines around his mouth, grooves of a sorrow that time alone had not smoothed. His thoughts circled back, as they often did, to the memory of Sarah, her auburn hair spread across a pillow, her laughter echoing through their home, her dreams of a family they would never have. The sudden, brutal absence had hollowed his life, and he had built walls to keep that grief from consuming him entirely. But Emily's presence, fragile and fierce, had cracked them open. Where does she go from here? Sheriff Rostova had asked him earlier that day, her tone practical but not unkind. The system will have to place her, Liam. There are foster families. It's the protocol. Protocol. The word tasted like ash. Liam had seen the underbelly of the system both abroad and at home. He had heard stories of kids bounced from home to home, treated like inconvenient paychecks. He thought of Emily's story, discarded by the one person who was supposed to care for her. Could he, in good conscience, send her back into that machine? A soft sound interrupted his dark thoughts. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and Emily peeked inside. Her hair was damp from a bath, clinging to her cheeks. She wore the oversized sweatpants he'd given her, the cuffs rolled multiple times, and thick socks that made her feet look comically large. In her arms, she clutched Ranger's worn leash like a security blanket. "Can I sit with you?" she asked, her voice a small thing in the quiet room. Liam nodded, pushing the DHS folder to the side. Of course. She slipped inside, Ranger padding softly behind her. The shepherd's tail gave a single, soft wag before he settled at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes watchful. Emily perched on the chair opposite Liam, drawing her knees up to her chest. Her brown eyes, too old for her face, studied him in the lamplight. After a long, silent moment, she whispered the question he knew was coming. "They won't make me go back, will they?" The question, so simple and so full of dread, pierced through him. Liam opened his mouth, but the assurances tangled in his throat. He saw the fear in her eyes, not the wild terror of their first meeting in the alley, but a deeper, more settled fear, the dread of being abandoned all over again. Before he could form a sentence, Ranger shifted. The shepherd rose and pattered across the wooden floor. He nudged Liam's hand with his cool, wet nose, then turned and circled back to Emily, pressing his head firmly against her side, as if physically pushing her toward Liam. Emily's thin fingers twisted in Ranger's fur. She looked from the dog back to Liam, and this time, her gaze was a clear, silent plea. The last of the walls he'd built around his heart crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but the fierce, clear need to protect this child. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, bringing himself down to her level. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm, "I don't know what the courts will decide in the long run, but I can tell you this. I'm not going to let you disappear into the cracks again. You have a place here for as long as you need it." Her lips trembled. For a moment, she said nothing, the only sound Ranger's steady breathing. Then, she slid from her chair and crossed the short distance to his side. With Ranger watching, a silent, approving witness, she placed her small hand into his. Her small, cold hand was almost weightless in his, a fragile bird trusting him not to squeeze too tight. Liam closed his larger, calloused hand around hers, his grip steady and sure. He felt something break open inside him, the cold, hard weight of his grief shifting, making space for something new, something warm and terrifying and right. In that simple gesture, he understood. She wasn't just a case file. She wasn't a temporary responsibility. She was family. Ranger let out a soft, contented woof, as if to seal the moment, his tail thumping quietly on the floor. The paperwork was still to come, the hearings and the evaluations, but in the quiet of the kitchen, a promise had been made. And Liam Cole was a man who kept his promises. The paperwork took weeks, longer than Liam wanted, but shorter than most bureaucracies allowed. Each form carried the weight of the promise he had made in his kitchen. Background checks, home evaluations, and countless interviews where he was asked the same question, phrased in a dozen different ways. Why do you want to take in this child? Liam Cole answered each one with the steadiness of a man who had faced both grief and gunfire. His storm blue eyes met every skeptical glance, his voice calm but unshakable. Because she deserves more than another cold bed in a house that doesn't want her, he'd say. Or, because I've lost enough to know what matters when you still have a chance to protect it. During one home visit, social worker Anna sat with Emily alone in the living room while Liam waited on the porch. Do you feel safe here, Emily? Anna asked. Liam held his breath, staring out at the snow-blanketed yard. The silence stretched for a beat too long. Then Emily's small, clear voice. Yes. Because of Liam and Ranger. They won't let anything bad happen. The final hurdle was the courtroom. Liam wore a suit that hadn't been out of the closet in years. Emily sat beside him at the heavy wooden table. As Emily stood, she nervously smoothed the front of her new purple coat, a vibrant replacement for the ragged one Liam had found her in. Ranger, groomed and majestic, lay at her feet under the table, his presence a secret source of strength. Judge Klein peered over the rims of her glasses. Mr. Cole, she began, her voice echoing slightly. Your record is exemplary. Your home study is adequate. But this is an unusual circumstance. You are a single man, a veteran with no prior experience parenting. This child has experienced significant trauma. Convince me that this is in her best interest. Liam stood, his posture straight, but not rigid. He spoke not to the judge, but to the truth. Your Honor, I can't offer her a traditional family, but I can offer her a safe one. I can offer her consistency. I can offer her a home where she will never have to wonder if she's a burden. She's already brought light back into a house that had been dark for a long time. She's not a case to me. She's family. He spoke of Emily's courage, of her laughter returning little by little, of how she was teaching Ranger to play fetch in the snow. He spoke of the way she'd started leaving her crayon drawings on his refrigerator. Judge Klein listened, her expression unchanging. Then she turned her gaze to Emily. And, you young lady, do you have anything you'd like to say? Emily's breath hitched. She looked at Liam, then down at Ranger. Slowly, she slid from her chair and knelt, wrapping her arms around the shepherd's neck. The dog lifted his head, licking her cheek once. That simple, unscripted act of affection seemed to steady her. She looked up at the judge, her voice small but clear. I want to stay with Liam and Ranger, she said. They're my home. Even the stern judge's expression softened a fraction. She looked from the child and the dog to the man who stood ready to shield them both. The order for temporary guardianship came through not long after. It wasn't adoption, not yet, but it was a foundation. Liam Cole was now legally responsible, not just as a moral duty, but as a guardian for the life of Emily Crawley. The morning after the decision, Pine Creek lay under a thick quilt of white, the world reborn in silence and glittering purity. The air was sharp but clean, carrying the scent of pine and chimney smoke. At the edge of town, Liam's pale blue house no longer seemed like a place of retreat, but a place of arrival. Inside, the walls echoed with new, life-affirming sounds. The shuffle of Emily's slippers on the floor, Ranger's paws clicking against the wood, the murmur of a child's voice asking questions about everything from pancakes to why icicles formed. That morning, Liam stood by the window with a mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched through the glass as Emily dashed into the yard, bundled in her purple coat, scarf trailing, boots kicking up powdery snow. Her laughter rang sharp and sweet against the cold air, a sound he knew he would never take for granted. Ranger bounded after her, a tan and black streak against the white, his tail slicing happily through the air. Emily shrieked with delight as the shepherd chased her in wide arcs, finally catching her by gently tugging at her mitten with his teeth. She collapsed into the snow, giggling, arms flung wide while Ranger lay down beside her, his body curved protectively around her. Liam's throat tightened at the sight. It was the first time he had heard that sound, Emily's unguarded, bubbling laughter, completely free from the undercurrent of fear. It was the sound of a childhood being reclaimed. He stepped outside, the cold biting his cheeks, but he hardly felt it. Emily leapt up and ran to him, her small boots crunching in the snow. She flung her arms around his waist, face tipped up to his, cheeks flushed pink. "Liam," she said breathlessly, "can we build a snowman?" He looked down at her, at the light in her eyes that had not been there weeks ago, and for a moment words failed him. Finally, he managed a smile, one that felt real and unforced, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Yeah, kiddo. Let's build a snowman." Ranger barked once, circling them as if to give his official approval. Later, as the three of them worked together, rolling lopsided spheres of snow across the yard, Liam felt something stir inside him, a warmth he had not known since Sarah. He remembered nights of silence, of walls that pressed in on him, of holidays spent alone with only Ranger for company. And now here was a girl who had crawled from the darkness of neglect into his life, bringing with her a light he had thought extinguished forever. When the snowman was finished, crooked hat, pebble smile, arms made of twigs, Emily clapped her mittened hands. Ranger sat beside it, tongue lolling, as though proud of their creation. Emily leaned against Liam's leg, hugging Ranger close with her other arm. Her small voice, muffled by her scarf, whispered the question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Liam looked down at her, his vision blurring slightly. He crouched, resting a hand on her shoulder, the other ruffling Ranger's thick winter coat. "Yeah, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are." The truth of it settled in his chest, heavier and more substantial than any badge or oath he had ever carried. This wasn't the family he had once imagined with Sarah. It was stranger, stitched together by grief and chance and a loyal dog's instinct. Yet it was real, strong, and chosen. Above them, snow continued to fall, soft and steady. The legal battle was won, but a new one was just beginning, the battle for Emily's peace of mind. But could a peace built on so much trauma ever truly last? The rhythm of their new life began to find its beat, a quiet, steady tempo that replaced the silence Liam had grown accustomed to. Mornings were no longer a solitary cup of coffee staring at the snow. They were pancake breakfasts where Emily would carefully measure the mix, her small tongue peeking out in concentration, and Ranger would sit hopefully by the stove, waiting for a dropped morsel. The house, once just a structure of wood and memory, was becoming a home again, its rooms animated by the sounds of life. Liam found himself learning the language of fatherhood in real time. It was in knowing that Emily was afraid of the dark hallway at night, so he installed a small, plug-in nightlight that cast a soft, star-shaped glow. It was in patiently helping her sound out words from a storybook after dinner, her small finger tracing the letters, as his deep voice provided the steady rhythm. It was in the way he checked the locks on the doors twice, not out of his old solitary vigilance, but with the fierce, protective focus of a guardian. Emily, in turn, was slowly unfurling like a flower in a sudden patch of sun. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill out. The wary tension in her small shoulders started to ease, replaced by the loose-limbed relaxation of a child who felt safe. She claimed a corner of the living room for her drawings, which were no longer just dark scribbles, but pictures of a tall man, a large dog, and a small girl under a yellow sun. She titled one, in her wobbly handwriting, "My Family." Ranger was the constant, the living thread that stitched their lives together. He slept outside Emily's door at night, a furry sentinel. During the day, he was her shadow, his presence a quiet reassurance that steadied her when a sudden noise or a raised voice on the television made her flinch. He seemed to understand his role intuitively, to be the bridge, the comfort, the playful distraction when the weight of the past seemed too heavy. One afternoon, A thick envelope arrived from the Department of Human Services. Liam's stomach tightened as he opened it at the kitchen table. It was the formal long-term guardianship agreement, along with a schedule for follow-up visits. It was a bundle of bureaucracy, but it represented permanence, stability. Emily watched him from the doorway, her expression clouding with the old fear. "Are they going to make me leave?" Liam stood and walked over to her, crouching down. He didn't touch her, just met her gaze. "No, Emily. This is the paperwork that says you get to stay. For good." The relief that washed over her small face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. She didn't say anything, just launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around his neck in a tight, wordless hug. It was the first time she had initiated such contact without the buffer of Ranger nearby. Liam held her, feeling the delicate bones of her back and over her shoulder. He saw Ranger thump his tail solidly on the floor, his job, for the moment, complete. Later that week, Liam decided it was time. He took Emily to Sarah's grave. It was something he had avoided for a long time, the pain too fresh, the silence of the headstone too loud. But now it felt necessary. He needed to introduce this new part of his life to the woman who had been his old life. The cemetery was peaceful under a layer of crisp snow, the evergreen trees standing as silent guardians. Liam brushed the snow from Sarah's simple granite marker. Emily watched, her small hand in his, her eyes wide and solemn. "This is Sarah," Liam said, his voice softer than usual. "She was my wife. She was the best person I ever knew." Emily was quiet for a long time, looking at the dates carved into the stone. "She was young," she whispered. "Yeah," Liam said, the old ache a dull throb in his chest. "She was." "Does it still hurt?" Emily asked, her child's intuition cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Sometimes," he answered honestly. "But it's a different kind of hurt now. It's like knowing a really beautiful song has ended. You're sad it's over, but you're glad you got to hear it." Emily processed this, her brow furrowed. Then she stepped forward and placed her small, mittened hand on the cold headstone. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly Liam almost didn't hear it. Liam's throat closed, and he had to look away, blinking hard against the sudden sting in his eyes. As they walked back to the truck, hand in hand, Ranger sniffing at interesting snowdrifts ahead, Emily looked up at him. "I thanked her for taking care of you," she explained, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "So you could take care of me." The simplicity and profound truth of her words struck Liam with a force that stole his breath. He stopped walking, looking down at this incredibly resilient child. In her own way, she had just given a meaning to his loss, a purpose to his pain that he had never been able to find on his own. That night, after Emily was tucked in, her nightlight glowing and Ranger settled on the rug, Liam stood in the living room, looking at the photos on the mantel. There was Sarah, forever smiling. And there now was a new one, a picture he'd taken just days before of Emily and Ranger, mid-laugh, covered in snow. The quiet of the house was different now. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a peaceful one, filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of a dog breathing in his sleep and the knowledge that a child was dreaming safely in the next room. The architecture of their family was unconventional, built on a foundation of loss and found in a trash-filled alley. But as Liam turned off the lights, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it was strong. It was real, and it was just beginning. The phone rang, shattering the morning quiet. Liam answered to hear Sheriff Rostova's tense voice. "Liam, they found her. Maggie Crawley. There's a hearing. The DA needs Emily to testify." The name landed in the quiet of Liam's kitchen with the force of a physical blow. He glanced into the living room where Emily was coloring, her head bent low over the paper, Ranger a warm, sleeping weight beside her. "Does she know?" he asked, his voice dropping. "Not yet," Rostova replied. "But she will. There's a hearing. The DA wants to make the case for terminating her parental rights entirely, and they need Emily's testimony to do it. It's the only way to make sure Maggie can never touch her again." A cold knot tightened in Liam's stomach. The idea of dragging Emily back into that world, of making her face the woman who had inflicted so much fear, felt like a profound betrayal. He had promised her safety. Now, the system was asking her to walk back into the lion's den for a piece of paper. He hung up and stood for a long time watching Emily. She was humming a tuneless song, completely absorbed in a world of purple and green crayons. The thought of that light in her eyes being extinguished by fear made his hands curl into fists. He didn't tell her that day. He let her have the afternoon. Let her help him chop vegetables for stew. Let her triumphantly correct him when he pretended to forget the steps. He let the normalcy of their life be a shield for a little while longer. But that night, as he tucked her into bed, the question he dreaded came. "Liam," she whispered, her eyes large in the dim light from the hallway. "Is something wrong?" He sat on the edge of her bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. Ranger, sensing the shift in mood, lifted his head from his rug. There was no hiding from her. She was too attuned to the currents of his silence. He chose his words with the care of a man navigating a minefield. "The sheriff called today, Em. They found your Aunt Maggie." All the color drained from Emily's face. Her spoon clattered into her cereal bowl, sending milk splashing across the table. The soft, sleepy trust in her eyes vanished, replaced by the old, wild terror. She shrunk back against the pillows, pulling the blanket up to her chin, as if it were armor. "Is she coming here?" "No," Liam said firmly, putting a steadying hand on the blanket over her leg. "No, she's in jail. She can't hurt you. But the people who make the laws, they need to hear from you to make sure she can never, ever be in charge of you again." Emily shook her head violently, a frantic, panic motion. "I don't want to see her. I can't." "You might not have to see her," Liam said, though he couldn't promise that. "You might just have to talk to a judge. Tell them what you told me. About the work, the belt, being hungry." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing silvery paths down her temples. "She'll be so mad at me," she choked out. "She'll find a way." It was the core of the trauma, the belief that the abuser was all-powerful, omnipresent. Logic held no sway here. "Listen to me, Emily," Liam said, his voice low and intense, leaning closer. "I will be right there with you. Ranger will be there. Sheriff Eva will be there. She is not stronger than all of us. We are your family now. We protect each other. And I will not let anything happen to you. Do you believe me?" She looked from his face, etched with fierce determination, to Ranger, who had now risen and come to lean his heavy body against the bed, offering his solid presence. Her small hand snaked out from under the covers and buried itself in his fur. She didn't say she believed him. The fear was still too great. But she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The days that followed were shadowed. The easy laughter was scarcer. Emily had nightmares, waking with gasping cries that brought both Liam and Ranger running to her room. She clung to Ranger during the day, her small anchor in a suddenly uncertain world. Liam prepared her as best he could. He role-played with her, him pretending to be the stern judge, asking her simple questions. "What is your favorite color? What is your dog's name? Can you tell me what you like about living with Liam?" He wanted the courtroom to feel less alien, wanted her to have a few safe, rehearsed answers ready. But he knew no amount of preparation could truly armor a child's heart against this. He watched the shadows return under her eyes and felt a helpless rage burn within him. This was the final battle for her freedom, and it was a battle she had to fight herself, with nothing but her own fragile voice as a weapon. The night before the hearing, she was silent through dinner. As Liam was washing the dishes, he felt a small presence at his side. He looked down. Emily was holding a crayon drawing. It was a picture of a courtroom. There was a large, scary figure with scribbled black hair on one side. On the other was a tall stick figure, a large four-legged shape, and a small girl, all holding hands. A bright yellow circle, a sun, was drawn above their heads. She held it up to him without a word. He took it, his throat tight. It was her map, her visualization of the coming trial. Them against her. And above it all, the sun, her symbol for hope. He knelt and pulled her into a hug, this time holding her tightly. "We'll be right there," he whispered into her hair. "All of us. Together." She clung to him, her small body trembling. But when she pulled back, she looked at the drawing in his hand and then back at his face. The terror was still there, but beneath it, he saw a flicker of the resilience that had kept her alive in that frozen alley. The hearing loomed, a dark cloud on their horizon, but the foundation of their strange, chosen family held firm, ready to weather the storm. The county courthouse was a monument of cold, imposing stone, its steps worn smooth by generations of anxious feet. To Emily, clutching Liam's hand with a grip that threatened to cut off his circulation, it looked like a fortress of doom. Ranger, granted special permission as a comfort animal, walked stiffly on her other side, his leash held tight by Sheriff Rostova. The shepherd's presence was a tangible shield, but even he seemed to feel the weight of the occasion, his ears slightly back, his amber eyes constantly scanning the echoing hallways. The air inside was stale and smelled of lemon-scented polish and old anxiety. They were led to a small, windowless room to wait. The walls were a pale, sickly green, and the only furniture was a scarred wooden table and a few hard chairs. It was a room designed for waiting, for stewing in dread. "You remember what we practiced, kiddo?" Liam asked, his voice soft in the stifling quiet. He knelt before her, blocking her view of the blank door. Emily nodded, her jaw clenched tight to stop it from trembling. She was wearing the purple coat, a deliberate choice Liam had supported. It was her armor, a symbol of how far she had come from the girl shivering in a ragged version of the same color. The door opened, and a court officer, a young woman with a kind but professional smile, peered in. "They're ready for Emily Crawley." The walk to the courtroom door felt like a mile. Liam squeezed her hand. "Ranger and I will be sitting right there in the front. You just look at us, okay? Just at us." Then the heavy door swung inward, and the world became a vast, terrifying space of high ceilings, dark wood, and dozens of silent, watching faces. The judge, the same Judge Klein from their guardianship hearing, sat elevated behind her bench, her expression unreadable. And there, at a table to the left, sat Maggie Crawley. Emily froze on the threshold. Her aunt looked smaller in an ill-fitting jumpsuit, her hair lank, but her eyes, those were the same. They locked onto Emily with a familiar, venomous intensity that promised a world of pain later. The hum of the fluorescent lights above sounded suddenly like a swarm of angry bees. A soft whine from Ranger broke the spell. The shepherd pressed against her leg, a solid, warm pressure that grounded her. Liam gave her hand one final, reassuring squeeze before letting go and moving with the dog to the front row bench. The prosecutor, a gentle-voiced woman named Ms. Flores, guided Emily to the witness stand. The wooden chair was too big, too high. Her feet dangled, and a bailiff had to lower the microphone for her. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Can you state your name for the record, sweetheart?" Ms. Flores asked. Emily's voice was a mouse-like squeak. "Emily. Emily, can you tell us who you live with now?" This was a safe question, one they had practiced. Her eyes found Liam. He nodded, his gaze steady. Ranger sat perfectly still beside him, his focus entirely on her. "With Liam and Ranger," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And can you tell the judge what it was like living with your Aunt Maggie?" The room seemed to grow colder. Emily's gaze flickered to her aunt, and the words died in her throat. Maggie's lips were pressed into a thin, white line. Emily could almost feel the sting of the belt, the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She started to shake, tears pooling in her eyes. She looked desperately at Liam, a silent plea for rescue. This was the moment Maggie's lawyer had been waiting for. "Your Honor, the witness is clearly too distressed. This is causing undue." He was interrupted by a sound, a low, concerned whimper. Ranger had taken a single step forward, his head tilted, his eyes fixed on Emily. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a bark. It was a sound of pure, unwavering empathy. That small sound was all Emily needed. It was a rope thrown into the dark well of her fear. She tore her eyes away from her aunt and looked only at the dog, at the man. She took a shaky breath. "It was cold," she began, her voice fragile. "And I was always hungry. I had to clean. All the time. The floors, The dishes. If I didn't... Her small hands gripped the edge of the wooden ledge. If I didn't do it right, she hit me. With the belt. The one that hung on the wall. The courtroom was utterly silent, every person captivated by the small, trembling voice weaving a tapestry of neglect. "Did you have a bed, Emily?" Ms. Flores prompted gently. Emily shook her head. "Just a board. With a dirty blanket." Her voice broke. "I just wanted food. That's why I ran away. I was so hungry." It was all out. The truth, raw and unvarnished, hung in the air. Maggie Crawley stared straight ahead, her face a stony mask, but the truth had done its work. It had stripped her of any facade of care. Ms. Flores nodded. "Thank you, Emily. No further questions." There was a cross-examination, a brief, brutal attempt by Maggie's lawyer to trip her up, to suggest she was making up stories for attention. But Emily, anchored by the two steady presences in the front row, answered in simple, devastating facts. Yes, she was sure. No, she wasn't lying. When she was finally allowed to step down, her legs felt like jelly. She didn't look at her aunt again. She walked straight to Liam, who enveloped her in a hug so tight she could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her cheek. Ranger nuzzled her hand, his warm, rough tongue giving her a quick, reassuring lick. They didn't stay for the closing arguments. Their part was done. As they walked out of the courtroom, the heavy door closing behind them, muffling the legal machinery still at work, Emily felt a weight lift from her small shoulders that she had carried for as long as she could remember. She was quiet on the drive home, exhausted. But as Liam carried her already half asleep from the truck to the house, she stirred and whispered into his neck, "I wasn't scared at the end." Liam looked down at her, his heart so full it ached. "I know, kiddo. I saw. You were the bravest person in that room." He laid her in bed, Ranger curling up instantly at his post. The legal outcome was a formality now. The real victory had been won in a few quiet sentences from a child who had finally found the courage to speak, backed by the silent, steadfast loyalty of a dog and the protective love of a man who had become her father. The shadow of Maggie Crawley, for the first time, truly felt like it was receding into the past. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday, a plain white envelope that held the power to reshape a life. Liam called Emily into the kitchen, crouching down so his steady gaze met her worried one. "It's over, Em," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "She can never, ever try to take you away. You are safe. For good." She stared at him, her brown eyes wide, searching his face for any hint of uncertainty. She saw only solid, unshakable truth. The tension that had lived in her small frame since the day of the hearing seemed to melt away, flowing out of her on a long, shuddering exhale. She didn't cheer or jump for joy. The relief was too profound for that. It was a quiet, settling peace. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his, a gesture of such intimate trust it stole his breath. "Okay," she whispered. That single word held a universe of meaning. "Okay, I believe you. Okay, it's really over. Okay, I'm home." From that day forward, a new chapter began, one written in brighter ink. The lingering shadows in Emily's eyes receded, replaced by a burgeoning confidence. She started talking about school, about wanting to learn to read bigger books. She began to sleep through the night without nightmares, the star-shaped nightlight now more a comfort than a necessity. And with the threat of Maggie gone, a new, beautiful word entered their vocabulary: adoption. It was Emily who brought it up one evening as they were washing dishes together, him washing, her drying. "Liam," she asked, carefully polishing a plate, "what happens now? I mean, after the termination?" "Well," he said, handing her a soapy glass. "Now, if it's what you want, a person can apply to become a kid's parent forever, through something called adoption. In the space of a single heartbeat, every loss, every battle, every moment of doubt crystallized into a single, unwavering truth." She was quiet for a moment, the only sound the clink of dishes and the splash of water. "Would you," she asked, her voice barely audible, "would you apply? For me?" Liam turned off the water and dried his hands, turning to face her. He crouched down, his heart pounding, as if he were asking the most important question of his life. "Emily, There is nothing in this world I want more than to be your dad. Officially. A smile, radiant and full, broke across her face. It was the smile he had seen in glimpses, but now it was unleashed, free from the last chains of fear. She threw her arms around his neck, the damp dish towel still clutched in her hand. "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Yes, please." The adoption process was a joyful echo of the guardianship ordeal, but this time, there was no underlying dread. The home visits from the social worker felt like welcoming an old friend. The paperwork was a promise, not a threat. Judge Klein, when they stood before her for the final time, allowed a genuine smile to touch her lips. "The court finds that this adoption is in the child's best interest," she declared, the gavel striking the sound block with a definitive crack. "The petition is granted. From this day forward, Emily Crawley shall be known as Emily Cole." The name change was the final stitch, sewing her seamlessly into the fabric of his life, into his very identity. They celebrated that night with pizza and a movie, a triumvirate of laughter on the couch, a father, his daughter, and their dog. Later, as Liam passed by Emily's, his daughter's, room, he paused in the doorway. She was asleep, one arm flung over Ranger's side, her breathing deep and even. On the wall beside her bed, she had taped her crayon drawing of the courtroom. But she had made a change. The scribbled black figure of her aunt was gone, carefully colored over with a bright blue crayon. The tall stick figure, the dog, and the small girl under the sun remained. He looked at them, his family, and felt a sense of wholeness, so profound it was almost dizzying. The journey had begun in a frozen alley, born from desperation and loneliness. It had wound through fear and fire and the cold mechanics of the law. But it had led here, to this quiet, perfect moment of peace. The bond they shared hadn't been forged by blood, but by choice, by loyalty, and by a love that had proven itself unbreakable. The past was finally, truly, behind them. The future, for the first time in years, felt not like something to be endured, but a story they would write together. Spring arrived in Pine Creek not with a bang, but with a slow, gentle thaw. Icy daggers fell from rooftops, the snow retreated to stubborn shadows, and the world began to breathe again. In the Cole household, the changing season mirrored an internal shift. The heavy blankets of winter, both literal and emotional, were being folded away, making room for new growth. The biggest symbol of this new chapter was a small, bright blue backpack hanging by the front door. It was time for Emily's first day of school. The night before, a familiar anxiety had flickered in her eyes. She'd pushed her peas around her plate at dinner. "What if the other kids don't like me?" she'd asked, her voice small. Liam had considered giving a pep talk about being friendly and confident. Instead, he told her the truth. Some might not. That's how it is for everyone. But you know what? You've already faced down scarier things than a playground. You'll be fine. Now standing on the sidewalk outside Pine Creek Elementary, her small hand in his, she looked impossibly young and brave in her new clothes. The playground was a cacophony of shrieks and running bodies. Ranger, sitting obediently at Liam's other side, let out a soft whine, sensing her tension. "You remember the plan?" Liam asked, crouching down. Emily nodded, her knuckles white where she gripped the blue backpack strap. "You and Ranger walk me to the door. Then you go home. Then you come back right here when the bell rings. And Ranger will be waiting to hear all about it," Liam said, ruffling the dog's fur. "Won't you, boy?" Ranger thumped his tail in agreement, his gaze fixed on Emily. "Okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and then, before her courage could fail, she let go of his hand and walked toward the school's main entrance, a tiny purple-clad soldier marching into the unknown. Liam watched her until she was swallowed by the stream of other children, his heart a tangled knot of pride and worry. The walk home was quiet, the house even quieter. Ranger paced for a bit, then settled by the front window, his ears drooping, clearly missing his charge. Liam tried to distract himself with chores, but his mind was at the school. Was she making a friend? Was she too quiet? Was someone being unkind? The hours stretched, elastic and slow. Finally, the time came. Ranger was already at the door, leash in mouth, tail wagging in frantic, eager sweeps. They took their post on the same stretch of sidewalk. The bell rang, a shrill clang that released a torrent of children. For a heart-stopping moment, Liam couldn't find her. Then he saw her. She wasn't running or laughing, but she was walking, her head held high, beside a little girl with red pigtails. They were deep in conversation. As she reached them, her face broke into a relieved, triumphant smile at the sight of her welcoming committee. "This is my dad, Liam, and my dog, Ranger," she said to the pigtailed girl, her voice ringing with confidence. The simple phrase, "my dad," sent a wave of pure, unadulterated joy through Liam that was more powerful than any victory he'd ever known. The girl, Maya, waved shyly and ran to her own mother. "So," Liam asked as they began the walk home, Emily swinging her backpack between them, "how was it?" The dam broke. Words tumbled out of her in an excited stream. She told him about her teacher, Mrs. Henshaw, who had a funny laugh, about the class hamster named Sparky, about how they got to draw pictures of their families, and she drew the three of them under a giant sun. Maya said she liked my drawing. Emily finished, beaming. She asked if she could come over and play sometime. "Of course she can," Liam said, his voice slightly thick. That evening, the house was filled with a new energy. Emily's drawings from school were proudly taped to the refrigerator, right next to her older ones. She chatted through dinner about spelling words and recess games. She was exhausted, but it was the good exhaustion of a day fully lived. As he tucked her into bed, she was already half asleep. "Dad," she murmured, the title now used with easy familiarity. "Yeah, kiddo. I think spring is my favorite season." "Yeah? Why is that?" "Because everything gets to start over," she whispered, her eyes closing. "And it's warm." Liam sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after she fell asleep, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. Ranger lay beside the bed, his job done for the day. The house was no longer a refuge from the world, but a base camp for exploring it. The silence was no longer empty, but replenishing, filled with the echoes of a child's laughter and the promise of tomorrow. He thought of the man he had been on that frozen Christmas Eve, closed off, navigating the world by habit alone. He had thought he was protecting himself from more pain, but he'd just been building a colder, quieter prison. Emily had not just been rescued. She had been the rescue. She and a loyal German shepherd had broken down the walls and let the light back in. The first day of school was just a small step, but it was a step into a future he had never dared to imagine. A future not of surviving, but of living. A future as a father. As he watched her sleep, he wondered what new challenges the world would throw at his brave, growing girl. The rhythm of their life settled into a comfortable, sun-drenched pattern. Mornings were a whirlwind of lunch-making and lost homework, afternoons filled with the sound of Emily's stories from school, and evenings spent reading on the couch, a tangle of limbs, dog fur, and quiet contentment. The past felt like a story from another life, a book that had been closed and placed on a high shelf. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the universe decided to test the strength of their newfound peace. They were at the park, the one with the old oak tree and the metal slide that got hot in the sun. Emily was on the swings, pumping her legs fiercely, trying to touch the sky with her toes. Liam leaned against the trunk of the oak, a book in his hand, while Ranger lay in a patch of clover, snoozing in the warmth. It was a perfect, ordinary moment. Without warning, the air was torn apart. A police siren, close and piercing, wailed from the main road. It was just a patrol car responding to a call, racing past the park without slowing. A common sound in any town. But for Emily, it was a tripwire. Her laughter cut off. A full-body tremor racked her small frame. Her eyes lost focus, staring at something only she could see. The forward momentum carried her back, and then she simply let go, tumbling into the wood-chip mulch below. She didn't cry out. She curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapping around her head, her entire body shaking. Liam was at her side in an instant, his book forgotten. "Emily? Kiddo, what's wrong? Are you hurt?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She was somewhere else. She was back in the alley, frozen in the headlights of a different kind of fear. She was in the courtroom, facing her aunt's glare. The siren had been a key, unlocking a room of terror she thought she'd left behind. Ranger was there too, whining, nudging her shoulder with his nose, confused and concerned by her sudden collapse. Liam's military training kicked in. Assess, don't assume. He didn't try to pull her hands away or force her to look at him. He simply placed a firm, steady hand on her back, right between her shoulder blades, a solid anchor point. "Emily," he said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the fading wail of the siren. "You're in the park. You're with me and Ranger. You just fell off the swing. You're safe. The sound is gone. Listen, it's gone." He kept talking, a quiet, repetitive monologue. "You're safe. You're with your dad. Ranger is here. The grass is green. The sun is warm. You are safe." Slowly, the violent trembling began to subside. Her breathing hitched, then deepened. She uncurled just enough to peek out from under her arm. Her eyes found his, wide and swimming with shame and confusion. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Hey, no," Liam said, his heart breaking a little. "Don't you ever be sorry for that. It's okay." He helped her sit up, brushing the wood chips from her clothes. Ranger immediately shoved his head into her lap, his entire body wiggling with the effort to comfort her. She buried her face in his fur, taking deep, shuddering breaths that smelled of dog and sunshine and safety. It sounded so loud," she mumbled into his coat. "It took me back." "I know it did," Liam said, still kneeling beside her. "That happens sometimes. It's called a trigger. Something you see, or hear, or smell can pull you right back into a scary memory. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you went through something really hard." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. As he spoke of his own triggers, he unconsciously rubbed the old scar on his forearm. "It happened to me, too. After I came home from the service, a car backfiring would sound like something else. I'd hit the deck before I even knew what I was doing." Emily looked up, surprised. "It happened to you?" "All the time," he admitted. "It gets better. It never goes away completely, but it gets better. And you know what helps?" She shook her head. "Having someone to bring you back," he said softly. "Having an anchor. For me, it was Ranger. And now it's you too. We're each other's anchors." The truth of it settled between them. They weren't just a family for the good times. They were a unit built for weathering the sudden storms, for pulling each other back from the edges of old nightmares. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, holding her close. They sat there in the wood chips for a long time, until the color returned to Emily's cheeks and the ghost of the siren had fully faded from the air. On the walk home, her hand found his, and she held it tight. The incident wasn't forgotten, but its power was diminished. It was no longer a secret shame, but a shared understanding. They had faced a ghost from the past together, and they had won. The echo of the siren hadn't broken them. It had only proven, once again, how unbreakable they were. In the days after the siren, Liam knew they needed a new project, something to focus on, to build together. He led her to the side of the house, to Sarah's old, neglected garden. The patch of earth had been ignored for years. Weeds choked the soil, and the remnants of a forgotten flower bed were barely visible. "What are we doing out here?" Emily asked, tilting her head. "We," Liam announced, handing her a small trowel and a pair of gardening gloves that were still too big for her, "are starting a garden." Her nose scrunched. "Why?" Liam looked at the barren patch, seeing a different kind of emptiness. "Because this was Sarah's garden," he said simply. "She loved watching things grow. And I let it go. I think it's time we brought it back to life." He didn't frame it as a chore or a lesson in horticulture. He framed it as a resurrection, a reclaiming. Emily looked from the dead earth to his face, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded, a small, serious gesture, and pulled on the gloves. The work was hard. They spent the morning pulling stubborn weeds, their hands getting dirty, the sun warming their backs. Ranger supervised from a cool patch of grass, occasionally trotting over to sniff a particularly interesting root they'd unearthed. Liam showed Emily how to loosen the soil, how to tell the difference between a weed and a potential flower. As they worked, they talked. Not about big, heavy things, but about small, important ones. The way worms felt in your hand, the shape of clouds. Why Ranger preferred to drink from the puddle near the hose instead of his clean water bowl. It was in the middle of a conversation about the best flavor of popsicle that Emily unearthed it. Her trowel hit something hard and metallic. She scraped away the dirt, revealing a small, tarnished silver locket, its chain a tangled silver snake in the dark soil. Liam's breath caught. He recognized it instantly. He took it from her, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the fragile clasp. It opened. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded photo of Sarah, smiling. On the other, a lock of auburn hair. Emily watched, her eyes wide. "Is that?" "Yeah," Liam said, his voice rough. "It's Sarah's. She must have lost it out here. I remember her looking for it." He held the locket in his palm, a forgotten treasure returned by the earth itself. He looked from the locket to Emily's expectant face, then at the freshly turned soil waiting for new life. A sense of profound rightness settled over him. It wasn't a sign, not exactly. It was an affirmation. "I think," he said, closing the locket and gently placing it in Emily's soil-stained hand, "that this should be yours now." Her fingers closed around it. "Really, really. She would have loved you so much, Em. She would be so happy you're here, bringing this garden back." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of connection. She clutched the locket to her chest, a tangible link to the woman who had loved the man who was now her father. They finished preparing the soil in a comfortable, reflective silence. That afternoon, they drove to the garden center, and Emily carefully picked out packets of seeds, zinnias, sunflowers, and cosmos, chosen for their bright, bold colors. She insisted on a small, fledgling rose bush, its label promising future blooms the color of a summer sunset. They planted them together, Emily making small holes with her finger and dropping in the seeds with a solemnity usually reserved for religious rites. Liam planted the rose bush, patting the soil firm around its base. They watered everything in, the dark earth drinking the water, promising a future of color and life. Weeks passed. Spring deepened. Liam and Emily fell into a new routine of checking the garden every morning. At first, there was nothing. Then, tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, fragile and determined. One Saturday, Emily came bursting into the kitchen, her face alight with a joy so pure it seemed to light up the room. "Dad, come quick. Come see." He followed her outside. There, in the garden, were the first true leaves of the zinnias, and the sunflower stalks were several inches high. But the miracle was the rose bush. It had produced its first bud, a tight, green fist of potential tinged with the faintest hint of gold. "It's working," Emily whispered, her voice full of awe. She looked from the garden to the locket she now wore every day, then to Liam. "We made it grow." Liam put his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked at the vibrant green life where there had been only neglect, at the child beside him who had blossomed from a place of darkness, at the dog watching them from the porch. "No, kiddo," he said softly, his heart so full he thought it might burst. "You did. You made everything grow." The garden was more than flowers. It was a living testament to their journey, from barrenness to life, from grief to hope, from two lonely souls to a family, rooted in love and chosen day by day. The past was not erased, but it was no longer a wasteland. It was the fertile ground from which their future was springing, bright and beautiful and alive. The first anniversary of the night in the alley arrived not with a storm, but with a gentle, persistent snowfall, just like the one a year before. But inside the blue house on the edge of Pine Creek, the world was warm and bright. The scent of pine needles and baking gingerbread filled the air, and a string of multicolored lights glowed softly around the living room window. This Christmas Eve was a world away from the last. Emily, now a sturdy, bright-eyed 8-year-old, stood on a stool, her tongue peeking out in concentration as she placed the star atop the Christmas tree. It was a little crooked, but to Liam it was perfect. "Perfect," he said aloud, his voice rough with emotion. She beamed, hopping down and brushing her hands together. "Now for the presents." Ranger, a red and green plaid bandana tied around his neck, thumped his tail in agreement from his spot by the hearth, his coat gleaming in the firelight. He was a year older, a little grayer around the muzzle, but his eyes held the same devoted warmth. As Emily began arranging the few wrapped boxes under the tree, her movements careful and reverent, Liam watched her. He saw not a trace of the feral, terrified child he'd found digging through garbage. He saw his daughter, confident, loved, whole. Her journey hadn't been a straight line. There were still nights when a bad dream would send her padding into his room, and he'd wake to find her curled at the foot of his bed with Ranger. There were moments of shyness at school, a flinch at a sudden loud noise. The scars were there, but they had faded into part of her landscape, not defining it. His own landscape had been irrevocably changed, too. The cavern of grief inside him wasn't gone, but it had been filled, not erased, but built upon. Filled with the sound of Emily's laughter, the weight of her trust, the simple, daily rhythm of being needed. He was no longer former Sergeant Liam Cole, the widower. He was Dad. "This one's for you, Ranger," Emily said, sliding a clumsily wrapped, bone-shaped package toward the shepherd. Ranger sniffed it, then licked her face, making her giggle. Later, after a dinner of stew and hot chocolate, they sat on the rug in their pajamas, the fire crackling. The gifts were simple: a new book for Emily, a warm sweater for Liam, a sturdy new tug toy for Ranger. But the real gift was the atmosphere in the room, a tangible feeling of peace and belonging. "Do you remember," Emily asked, her voice soft as she stared into the flames, "what you said to me that first night? In the alley?" Liam's chest tightened. He remembered every second. The biting cold, the flickering light, the overwhelming sight of her. "I said a lot of things. I was trying not to scare you off." "You said, 'You're not alone right now,'" she quoted, her memory precise. She looked at him, her brown eyes serious. "I didn't believe you then. Not really. I thought you were just being a grown-up. But you were telling the truth." "I was," he said, his throat tight. "I'm not alone anymore," she stated, a simple, profound declaration of her new reality. "No, you're not," Liam agreed. "And neither am I." She crawled over and leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her, pulling her close. Ranger, not to be left out, rested his heavy head on Liam's knee, completing the circle. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the fire dance. Liam's mind drifted over the year, the fear, the court hearings, the first day of school, the discovery of the locket, the blooming of the garden. It had been a year of battles, both legal and emotional, and they had fought them together. This family of theirs hadn't been born from convenience or biology. It had been forged in the cold fire of a Christmas Eve alley, in the heat of a warehouse confrontation, in the quiet anxiety of a courtroom, in the simple daily acts of making breakfast and reading stories and planting seeds. It had been hammered out on the anvil of shared experience, its bonds tempered by protection, loyalty, and a love that had chosen to stay. Emily eventually fell asleep against his shoulder, her breathing deep and even. Carefully, Liam lifted her and carried her to bed. Ranger followed, settling into his now permanent spot on the rug beside her. Liam tucked the blankets around her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. On her nightstand, next to the star-shaped nightlight, sat the silver locket. He stood in the doorway, looking at his daughter and his dog, the two beings who had saved him as much as he had saved them. The storm of the past was over. The silence of the house was no longer empty, but filled with the echoes of a child's laughter and the steady rhythm of a dog's breath. Liam looked at his daughter, her head resting trustingly against his side, and at the dog who had brought them together. The greatest miracles, he knew, didn't arrive with trumpets or bright lights. They came quietly on a freezing night, offering a second chance in the form of a lost little girl and a loyal friend. They were, and always would be, a family,
If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Bonds Unspoken. Every click helps us share more incredible moments that celebrate the bond between humans and animals. And be sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us what true loyalty feels like.